Hello everyone and welcome to my channel, The Little Things Junkie. My name is Jonathan and you are very welcome here. Thank you for joining me. Today's video is just going to be me painting a little figure. I recently did a review of this box set from ICM and I'm going to paint this middle officer here today on camera for you. Now, it wasn't the easiest thing to film while I was painting it. I mean, it is a tiny little 1/48 figure after all. But I did my best. I think I managed to get most of it in front of the camera most of the time. I hope you enjoy what you're about to see as much as I enjoyed painting it. Okay, let's run through the equipment I'll be using. I use a wet palette and I use water, just plain tap water, to dilute the paint. My choice of brush is Winsor & Newton Series 7. For this figure I used the size 1, and although I had a 00 on standby, I only used the larger brush for this piece. Also to hand is a piece of kitchen towel to unload the brush prior to applying paint to the figure. What I've done first of all is to assemble the figure and prime it grey. Then, as something of an experiment, I gave it a couple of washes of Citadel Contrast Black Templar. In all honesty, it offered no advantage to a straight black or grey primer, but you don't know if you don't try. Enough of the preamble, let's get on and paint this thing, starting with the face. The paint I'm using for the flesh base coat is mostly Vallejo 804 Beige Red, with a little bit of 921 English Uniform added into it. What I want to achieve here is an even coverage over the whole face, so the paint is fairly diluted to avoid any unsightly brush marks in the paint. Obviously it takes longer to cover when the paint is diluted like that, but that's the price I'll pay for getting a smooth finish to the flesh. At this stage, hopefully you can see the areas around the eyes are still quite black, also around the moustache and inside the ears. These are areas which have received fewer thin coats, or if any at all coats, and still show the dark primer. I'll take the same mix of flesh colour I've just used and then thin it down to a very thin dilution, which I'll then use to glaze the entire face area. Those black areas will then blend into the painted parts of the face, but still appear as dark shadow areas. Now it's time to start highlighting the face. I'll use the same base flesh colour with some Vallejo 845 Sunny Skin Tone added to lighten it. The highlights will go on the upwards facing parts of the face, such as the cheekbone, down the centre line of the nose, tip of the nose, the nostril flares, tips of the ears. Using this first highlight, I'll gradually start to build up the form of the face. I'm using this paint thinned, but not yet diluted down to glaze consistency. Now I've done that, I'm going to glaze over those same areas with a very thin dilution of that previous colour, just to blend them into the surrounding skin tones, like I did with the dark areas around the eyes earlier on. After that, it's time for Sunny Skin Tone on its own. Using the same method as before, I'm picking out the highest upward facing parts of the face and then glazing over them with a very thin glaze of Sunny Skin Tone. Now I'm going to use Panzer Ace's Highlights Flesh, and there's going to be a bit of trial and error here. I'm going to start with this mixed into Sunny Skin Tone to see what the result is. If I don't like it, I can just use the Highlights Flesh on its own. So this is it mixed 50-50 with Sunny Skin Tone to see what kind of effect I'm going to get here. And I think for the moment, that will do. Later on, I go back with brighter highlight once the rest of the head is finished. Now what I'm going to do is crack on and do some shading and add a little colour to his face. Again, there's going to be a bit of trial and error here to get these shades right. And I'm going to start with Vallejo 859 Black Red. As with all these shades, they're going to be applied in a very thin glaze, maybe even thinner than that. But let's unload the brush and start with that. What I'm doing here is just bringing some colour into the face, warming up the cheeks and around the temples. And I'm also going to start adding colour to the deeper recesses of the face, so that's the lines that run down either side of the nose and under the chin. I'm not going to go too far under the peak of the cap, firstly because it's darn difficult to do that on camera, but also the peak is going to be in shadow and I don't want to overwork that area too much. The way I paint a figure usually is a responsive method. And by that I mean I don't use a formula for painting particular colours or particular parts in a particular way on a figure. When I paint, I'll put colours down and respond to what I then see. I think sometimes it helps to build up the form of the face first, then start adding details, then see how the rest of the face responds to those details. What I'm going to do now is start painting the lips and the moustache, and then see how the face appears with those details on, and then see what else I need to do. For the lips I've taken some of that black red and added approximately 50% mahogany brown from Vallejo. For the moustache I'm using approximately 50-50 English uniform with black, and I'm going to use that same mix to also start blocking in the hair. To highlight both the moustache and the hair, I'll just add sunny skin tone into that same mix. And I'm adding even more sunny skin tone just for the highest points of light. It looks like he's got a bit of lipstick on at the moment, so I'm going to warm up the corners of the mouth to kind of disguise that a little bit, and I'm going to darken underneath the chin. Right, first of all though, let's get on and do some glazes and try to get some warmth into those cheeks. Darken under the chin, I'm using black red again, with just a dot of black added, and I'm deepening the shadow right up underneath the chin into the part that receives the least light of all, so right where the chin meets the throat. Now I'm closing in on the completion of what I can manage on this face, but there are a few tiny bits I want to do before I call it a day. And I'm going back to the Panzer Aces Highlights Flesh. I'm just going to put in some pure highlights, just a few tiny spots here and there. I'm going to go to the tip of the nose, the very, very tip, maybe the nostril flares too. And a couple of little spots on top of the ears as well. And finally, something I often like to do is put a tiny highlight right in the middle of the lower lip. There you go, and that gives it a little wet glisten. And with that, I'm calling this face finished. Now let's move on to the blue parts of this figure. So that's the cap and the trousers. I'm going to start with the cap, and I'll use Vallejo Field Blue with a little dot of black added to darken and desaturate it. And I'll give the blue coats a couple of fairly thin coats of this mix. Now I've done that, I'm going to apply the field blue on its own without the black. I'm going to do it in lightly diluted layers and then glaze over it with a very thin dilution of the field blue. Now I've noticed something quite strange going on here with this blue. I don't know if you can see, but it seems to have tiny little white specks in it and it feels very grainy. I suspect there's something wrong with this particular bottle and I should have to discard it and replace it. It doesn't seem to be working very well, but I'll persevere and see if it improves at all. I've added some of the highlights flesh to the field blue for the highlight tone. Now here's a lesson. Do your research before you start painting. I was painting this in the mistaken belief that the cap band was blue and the peak was black, when in fact it's the other way around. The cap band should be black and the peak should be blue. So I'm going to apply some glazes of black over the band to darken it and make it appear black, and then paint the peak in the same colour as the cap's crown. With that done, I'm going to place some highlights and details on the chin strap, and for that I have Vallejo black mixed in with that highlights flesh. Having put those highlights in, I need to put a little bit more contrast along the lower edge of the strap to define it a bit more. I'll darken it where it needs to be using neat black. Now the only thing left to do to this cap is paint the badge. Wish me luck with that, will you? The badge has three elements. The upper element is an embroidered gold and red crown, then there's a pair of metal wings, and then below the wings are what I believe to be embroidered feathers. I want to make the embroidered elements look different from the metal elements, so I'm going to use different colours to do that. I don't know how this will go, or if it will be noticeable in the finished figure, but let's go ahead and find out. For the embroidered elements, I'm going to paint the Vallejo 914 green ochre mixed with English uniform, approximately 60-40. I'll see if I can pick out some of the shapes of the crown and the feathers. And for the metallic element, I'm going to use Game Colours Scrofulous Brown. Well, that's about as good as I'm going to get for the first part of this, and I consider myself pretty lucky to have achieved even that. To finish the badge, I'll have to go off camera so I can bring the figure closer to my knackered old eyes. Well, that badge got the better of me, and I don't mind admitting defeat. It was fun though, it was good fun trying. I don't know if you can see them at all, but for the red velvet parts of the crown, I used Vallejo Black Red, and I've highlighted the different elements just by adding Panzer Ace's highlight flesh into the respective base colours. The badge doesn't bear close scrutiny, it doesn't particularly look like a crown, an eagle and some feathers, but at least he's got something on the front of his cap now. And with that, and for the time being at least, the head is finished and it's time to move on to the trousers. Using Vallejo Field Blue with a spot of black again, I'll apply a thin coat over the whole of the trousers, save for the very darkest nooks and crannies. These will then be glazed over with the same blue-black mix. Here are the trousers, the first stage done. Hopefully you can see there are very dark areas which are unpainted, and now I'm going to glaze over the whole of the trousers with that very thin glaze I mentioned a moment ago. I've now glazed over those dark areas and they appear less black, and I'll use a dilution of Field Blue on its own and start applying some highlights. With that done, I've added some Panzer Ace's highlights flesh, just like I did with the cap, and now I'm going to put some further highlights using thin paint, of course. That's looking quite nice, I think, but it could do with more contrast, particularly around those tight wrinkly areas at the bottom of the legs. To achieve that, I've mixed some Field Blue with a large amount of black. This is a kind of black, off-black colour if you like. I'm just going to put in some glazes to increase the contrast. And with that, let's call the trousers done. The next step is to paint the boots, and almost from the start these don't go as I hoped. Here I'm using very dark grey to base coat the boots, but I soon realised it's nowhere near dark enough. And here I've added Vallejo Sunny Skin Tone into the grey and thinned it down quite a lot. I'm going to start placing in the first highlights of the boots, just trying to bring out the overall form of the boot with the leg and the foot within it. As you can see, the boots don't look particularly black. I shouldn't have used German grey as a base coat. That colour may work for combat boots, but for 1/48th scale flight boots, I should have just started with black and worked the highlights up from that. So what I'm going to do to overcome this is glaze some black over the grey. Now I could use ordinary acrylic paint, but this time I'm going to use this ink. It's beautifully smooth, it flows very well from the brush, and this particular black is as black as your hat, so it's really going to blacken those boots up nicely. I watered it down slightly and then applied a few glazes pretty much over all the boots to blacken it up a bit more. I'll avoid the highlighted areas and concentrate just on the places that are in shadow. My intention with all this is to make some very bright highlights along the boot to indicate the shine, and to do that I need a lot of contrast, which is why I really need to make those boots blacker than they currently are. Hopefully this is evident on your screen, but I can already see how just 3 glazes over the inner part of the boot has darkened it nicely. Here are the blackened boots, and what I've done to the right boot off camera was just add a few very high specular highlights. Hopefully these sell the illusion that these are polished boots. What I did to achieve that was to take some thin, very pale grey paint and apply very small spots of highlight. I shall do the same on this boot, and then all that remains is to paint a brass buckle on each boot. And that's the boots finished. As you can see, there's now a little buckle either side of him for him to secure his boots. For those I used Vallejo Japanese uniform, and then added white for the highlight, and then a tiny spot of almost pure white in the very top corner. Before we move on to painting the jacket, you may have noticed there are some changes to the figure, and the first one of which is the zips on the front of the boots. These aren't sculpted in the plastic, and I only spotted their absence once I thought I'd finished the boot. What I've done is I've painted a very thin line of pale grey and highlighted it with a few spots of paler grey, and then each side of that grey line I've painted another very thin black line. Off camera I've painted his silk neck scarf and his book, and most obviously I've started painting the jacket's wool lining that pokes out from the bottom of the Irving jacket. However, I'm dissatisfied with this and I'll go back and repaint it in a second. So I've repainted it black, and now I'm going to glaze over it with thinned Vallejo 843 cork brown. Having done that, I've added Vallejo 986 deck tan into the cork brown to lighten it up a tad, and I'm going to go around and highlight the wool. Once I've highlighted all the wool in that way, I'm going to go back and highlight it even further with a few tiny specks of neat deck tan. Alright, that's it now, and there's just the leather of the jacket itself to paint. For that I'm going to start with Vallejo 872 chocolate brown, applied in thin coats to slowly build up the colour, avoiding any areas that I want to stay relatively dark. With a good coat of that chocolate brown over the Irving jacket, I'll add Vallejo 856 ochre brown to the chocolate brown and start to highlight using thin glazes. The challenge with leather is to make the transitions from highlights to shadow quite sharp, so you get the appearance of a sheen. If you paint soft transitions, you risk it looking like fabric rather than a shiny leather. I've added ice yellow to the previous mix of chocolate and ochre browns, and you can see I've already made a start on the belt and some other areas. I'm just highlighting areas that need to be lighter, so this gives a bit more form to the jacket, but it also starts to indicate parts of the jacket that may be a little worn. While I'm doing this, I can see I'm already going to have to go back and reinforce some of the shadow areas. And thinking about how I'm going to do this, I reckon a mix of black and red brown will do. I'm using paint that is less dilute than a glaze, but is nevertheless very thin. I'm applying tiny little amounts. The thinner the paint, the easier it is to control how much pigment you put down on the figure. You can add paint layer by layer to a figure easily, but you can't easily remove it once it's down. And by using tiny amounts on the brush, you can just build up the pigment in your own time. So here's the jacket highlighted, and I've also put in some of those warmer shadows that I mentioned previously. Now it's time to paint the zip. There's a zip down there, and in front a little zip pull, and there's a buckle on his belt. I'm going to use a mid-grey paint for that. I'm just going to paint these in and then highlight with a lighter version of the same grey. Finally, but not quite finally, there's one more thing to do, and that's paint the tape that goes down either side of the zip. I don't know what this was made of on the real Irving jacket, but I suspect it's cotton, so I've just mixed up any old brown for that job. Now I'm going to risk ruining the paint job by spraying a matte varnish over the figure. I think the trousers are too shiny, and the boots are definitely too shiny as they are, and something needs to be done. I've waited a couple of days now and come back to look at this with fresh eyes. I'm really not satisfied with the leather jacket. it just looks a little insipid, too desaturated and not rich enough, not warm enough. I think this is exacerbated by the newly applied matte finish. To overcome that, I'm going to glaze over it with burnt umber oil paint. This will hopefully have two effects. Firstly, to provide the tone I want, and secondly, to impart a little sheen to the jacket. This is an extremely thin oil paint glaze, applied carefully. I'm going over all of the leather parts, and I think you can already see it's beginning to look more natural now. And there is the finished figure, ready to be added to a base or a little scene. But that's for another day. Right, well, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you got some information out of it or just used it for pure entertainment. If you did enjoy it, please give the video a thumbs up and leave a comment below. It's nice to chat to people. I'll see you in the next video.